My name is Aziz Rana. I teach law at Cornell University, and it's really my honor to moderate this last panel. I want to thank the organizers for an incredibly stimulating day, and I'm just very excited to be on the stage with these three panelists, all of whom I've learned a ton from. The charge for us, the title of our panel, is a broad question: is democracy on the side of freedom? Before we get into it, I just want to introduce briefly each of the three speakers. First we have Elizabeth Hinton, who's the John Loeb Associate Professor of the Social Sciences in the Departments of History and African American Studies at Harvard University. She's the author of a terrific recent book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. Next we have Megan Ming Francis, who's visiting Associate Professor of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and the author of another excellent book, Civil Rights in the Making of the American State, as well as a recent article that I strongly encourage everybody here to read called The Price of Civil Rights: Black Lives, White Funding, and Movement Capture, that was recently published in the Law and Society Review. Did I have that right? Yeah. And finally, we have Astra Taylor, writer, documentarian, organizer, whose movie What is Democracy, as well as companion book, Democracy May Not Exist, But We'll Miss It When It's Gone, has been floating through our day. So just as an initial framing for the broader conversation that we'll have, so is democracy on the side of freedom? I just want to note up front that if you grew up in the US at any point really in the last half century, this had a pretty clear answer. So answer number one, yes, democracy is on the side of freedom. And then even more critically, answer number two is there was a particular account of what democracy meant. In other words, there were a set of clear components that as I just work through them will be familiar. Component number one, we have a constitutional system that, regardless of the problems that we heard about in the last panel, so the ways in which federalism, the court structure, actually fragments popular power, this constitutional system is virtually perfect as a distillation of liberal democracy. Component two, it goes hand in hand with market capitalism. So market capitalism is the way, broadly speaking, that economic power should be organized, and that it's necessarily joined, it's indispensably connected to the political institutions of liberal democracy, too. Three, the country as a kind of sociological matter, just like the background social order, is one that's organized on principles of equality and is ethically committed to a project of universal equality. And what that means is that in the present, the only kinds of reforms you need, especially in the context of race, but in the context of class, gender, immigration, are reforms that we can think of as small-scale, ameliorative, built around, as Dorian noted in the last panel, inclusion, liberal inclusion at the margins. And then there's a fourth element, which is all of this is tied necessarily to the promotion of American global power, that the US is the first nation among equals, and that what it does abroad, because it is essentially democratic, is to promote democracy and freedom. Now, something that Lorella said in the last panel that really stuck with me, which is, and this is, I'm going to just come back to it a bunch of different times, these ideas were not right-wing, quote-unquote, ideas. They're not the ideas of market fundamentalists, of conservative reactionaries, of those that are stonewalling policy. This was the essential compact at the heart of modern American liberalism. And the reason why that's actually really important to note is because this moment that we're living in, so the moment of Trump, the moment of a resurgent white supremacism, is a moment that is an historical culmination. So it's a deep historical culmination in the sense that what white supremacist politics has long been built on is the idea that democracy for some actually inherently requires the systematic oppression of others. And so that's a deep, long-running strain. One might even say that's been historically the most dominant mode of American political thought since well before the founding. But then there's a second way in which it's an historical culmination, and that's the fact that the last 20 years have been marked by rolling social crises. Crisis number one, that we don't really talk about enough in the present, the Iraq War, and the ways in which that generated, massive strains, not just on the economy, brutalizing effects for poor people in the cities and rural areas, and also raised profound questions about the basic expertise of national security elites. Crisis number two, the financial crisis, and the ways in which it undermined the legitimacy of economic expertise and produced mass immiseration. And then let's say crisis number three, which exploded in a set of social protests, rebellions from 2014, 2016 that highlighted, even in the time of post-racialism, what we see in the US is the persistence of hyper-incarceration and structural racial subordination. Now, all of these crises were grounded in ideas that went to the heart of modern American liberal assumptions. They're the product of policy choices, ideological commitments of both parties based on those four essential premises. And then the effort to respond to these problems, even during the Obama years, were still marked by just a return to the same essential premises that had generated the problem. So you have both the construction of the problems through these ideas, as well as the limitation of an ability to respond to them. And that means that right now, we have both a diagnostic project as well as a transformative one. The diagnostic one is, well, what produced the set of historical failures that led to our present, and to what extent were liberal institutions themselves, the liberal centers of power, at least partly, even if at times inadvertently, responsible for these problems? And then secondly, how do we actually engage in a genuine project of transformation and emancipation? And all of this means, again, to kind of echo what we heard in the last panel, that one cannot imagine the solution as nostalgia, restoration, because the question has to be like, what are we nostalgic for? The very conditions that led to the present crisis. And so we're going to try to work through this historically. It won't be quite in the same order that we see up front, but let's begin with Megan's wonderful work. So Megan's piece, The Price of Civil Rights, engages with the question of philanthropy.
Wow.
So Megan's piece begins with the question of the relationship between philanthropy and movement organizing. And there's no doubt, as what we're discussing today, that these two are deeply imbricated. But there are a set of choices, perhaps leading to unintended consequences, that might be tied to the predicament we find ourselves in. And your work focuses especially on the period from the 20s to the 50s with the Garland Fund and its relationship to the NAACP. What lessons, tell us a little bit about that, and what lessons can we learn for thinking about the present?
Great. Oh, my goodness. What a hard act to follow. Let me do the first things first. Really want to thank the organizers for putting so much time and thought and care into this conference. Also, in terms of my fellow panelists, wow. Right, so like I teach these two. I listen on the Dig podcast. Astra and Aziz have amazing, also, I mean, it's just incredible. So it's really good to be here. All right, so I have about 6 minutes to try to tell a bit much larger story that occupied about 5 years of my life. So I'm gonna try to do that, and then I'm gonna try to draw a few lessons out of that. So one of the lodestars, kind of the centerpiece of liberal philanthropy, the story that is always told, is the story about the Garland Fund, which is a radical philanthropy in the 1920s, made up of the most progressive of white people in New York City. And they fund the NAACP. The reason why we get Brown v. Board of Education is because of the Garland Fund. Right, let me say that again, because I think that's something, if you're not in legal history, you don't know. But the reason why we get Brown v. Board, right, of Education, that then it's some mandate from the Supreme Court that at least Jim Crow in the area of education would be no more, is because the Garland Fund bankrolled the NAACP's litigation efforts. It's kind of often held up as this is what a kind of the combination and or the collaboration between an organization and a liberal funder. This is what you can achieve. You can change the kind of the rules of the game, right? But there's a different story that I actually kind of try to tell. So I wrote a book about the NAACP's campaign against racial violence in the first quarter of the 20th century. And I presented this, and the question that I always got was, Well, we know the NAACP as an education kind of centered organization. That's why the kind of the fight around civil rights is very much centered and anchored by education and voting rights. So what happened? And then that led to me digging into the archives to try to figure out what happened. What happened, and I'm going to try to tell this again very quickly, is essentially a story about the NAACP in the early 20th century, again, focusing on this issue of lynching and mob violence, and really believing that the fight for civil rights had to be focused on racial violence, because in order to enjoy other rights in American society, African Americans needed to live. Right? And so this was the central fight of the NAACP in the first 2 decades of the organization's existence. And then what happens is that they, like many organizations, you guys are from many different organizations, they can barely keep the lights on. They can keep the lights on today, right? But like before, they could barely keep the lights on, and they did not have any big funders. And here we have this organization, well, this funder, the Garland Fund. And the Garland Fund's main issues were labor, in education. And what happens over about a 3-year time span is that they provide the NAACP with a smaller grant. They're like, wow, the NAACP is able to do a lot with a little. And then they have this idea, they're kind of not bored, they don't feel that a lot of their labor funding is producing the results that they want. So they want something big. And so they basically conspire with James Weldon Johnson, Walter White, and W.B. Du Bois to actually fund this larger campaign against education. The story that is like, for some reason, never told, for some reason, that's another lecture, right? That's never told is that those 3 leaders of the NAACP at the time were really trying to push this issue of racial violence, but at the same time did not want to lose the possibility of going after education, which is still, right, still a very important issue to Black freedom. And so over a kind of a 3-year time span, the NAACP's campaign against racial violence basically falls to the sidelines. And then what comes in terms of the centerpiece of the NAACP's civil rights agenda is a focus on education, and the strategies also change. And the strategy changes to one focused on litigation. How do we fight this in the courts, right? So there's I think this is a historical, obviously, case study, but I think it maps on to a lot of what's going on today in terms of marginalized groups and what to do oftentimes in relationships where sometimes kind of issues converge, but oftentimes they don't, right? In terms of kind of the lessons, 2 quick results and then 3 very quick lessons. I think the results of this in terms of for Black activists was in so many ways the sundering of racial violence and the sanitization of a civil rights movement agenda that still very much influences politics and organizing today, that is centered on education. And racial violence now has emerged onto the agenda because of the courageous work of activists on the ground that have now made this an issue and have refused and have said that we have to address this. Right? If we're going to address civil rights, we're also going to address this. The end result, I think, for funders, in terms of the kind of the consequence of not confronting this history, has allowed well-meaning funders to operate in a space where they are not accountable for some of the harm that has been done to the struggle and the current vision of civil rights. What we can learn very quickly, because I'm probably at my time here, so I'm just going to list them off and then I can talk more about this. 1, I think funders need to do a better job at acknowledging this history. I can say a lot about Ford, about La Raza, NAACP, right? There's a lot, and it's not just Ford, it's a lot of foundations and it's a lot of funders. And I think we all can learn a lot from the history, from this history of in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Also, this is something that I've been thinking a lot about. Oftentimes people are saying, well, why didn't James Weldon Johnson push back harder? I often think that pushback rarely sounds like we think it should sound, right? And it's also not the responsibility of groups to, I don't think that's the issue. I think it's the problem oftentimes for funders is that we don't hear them. And we don't, and the ways in which they do push back, we don't actually locate that. And then two final things I want to touch on, amplify something that Professor Jamila Mishner said, as well as Councilwoman Gim. And this idea in terms of, they both raise very important issues. One about the need of I can't tell you, right? I can't be the author of what this dream should look like. It really should be led by the people. Also, in terms of this other issue that was raised by kind of focused on specific issues, and that Councilwoman Gim raised the point that many of these people on the ground are confronting multiple issues. And so the two lessons that I want to raise are perhaps one, that the people, and this is not controversial at all, but I don't think this is something that we actually practice, but the people most impacted should be leading the change. And then two, and this is my last point, I promise, my last point is that I think that we should think much more about what movement funding might look like instead of issue funding. I think that sometimes we don't allow what we need to do. I'll end there.
So, Elizabeth, just moving forward historically in time, that, we heard a fair amount about how, if we think of the New Deal Compact and the post-war period, the 30s, the 40s, and 50s, well, this was the high tide of social democracy, but it had its problems about exclusion. The moment that you can think of, well, okay, was there an effort within the terms of American liberalism to actually make social democracy compatible with anti-racism? The thing that comes to mind for many people is the 60s war on poverty. And this is the basis of a lot of your work. And the way that we tell or narrate the story about what happened to the war on poverty, not unlike how we tend to narrate stories about more recent political pushbacks, is conservative reaction, conservative stonewalling that stripped away those achievements. And I'd like you to just sort of, help us work through, how should we think of the war on poverty? What generated the pushback? What's the role of the liberal imagination in conceiving of it? Your reflections.
So thank you for that question, and also for the introduction and framing the panel so beautifully. Thank you to the organizers, to Kevin, to inviting me and including me in this conversation, to my fellow panelists, and most of all to all of you for coming, for the work that you do, for being part of this conversation. So I think that question about some of the shortcomings of the war on poverty goes back to your point at the outset about the kind of ways in which liberal logics themselves have set a framework for inequality that we've been living in, and for the past half-plus century. I really think that the war on poverty marks it is a story of a tragedy, marks a failed moment in our domestic policy that is in some part the consequence of the fundamental racist assumptions at the heart of liberal social policy that have steered subsequent policies. So the war on poverty in many respects did not go far enough because of the ways in which liberal social scientists and the policymakers who they influenced, from Lyndon Johnson to his Attorney General Ramsey Clark to Sergeant Shriver, who was the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, understood the root causes of Black poverty. So this was the first time in the history of the federal government where policymakers committed to addressing the problem of racial discrimination and also launching an intervention that would target low-income Black Americans. In framing that intervention, Johnson and his Council of Economic Advisors understood Black pathology and behavior as being the root cause of that poverty, and not structural forces, not historical discrimination and centuries of exclusion from certain resources. So in kind of that misdiagnosis of the root causes of poverty, the programs that federal policymakers supported were, in the words of Johnson's Attorney General Ramsey Clark, were meant to help the disadvantaged help themselves. They conceived of the war on poverty as a self-help program that could be fought relatively cheaply. It did mark an unprecedented billion-dollar investment into social programs. But they said, we don't need to, if Black pathology is the root cause of poverty, then we don't need fundamental structural changes. We don't need job creation programs. We just need job training programs. We don't need to fundamentally restructure our educational system. We need to provide remedial education. We can provide women with the tools to become better mothers and homemakers, and we can essentially reach out to alienated Americans, and these are the terms that policymakers and social scientists like Daniel Patrick Moynihan use in describing these targeted groups. We can reach out to and identify alienated citizens and kind of give them a set of behaviors that will help them become productive citizens. This was the fundamental organizing logic of the war on poverty. And of course, this doesn't provide a real roadmap out of fundamental inequality. There is a kind of silver lining here and a real missed opportunity. And what I see the tragedy of the war on poverty being is exactly this moment when the federal government did make a concerted effort to empower communities, which is something that Megan kind of ended her remarks on, and that's been a theme of a solution all day. So during the first year of the war on poverty, through this amazing principle called maximum feasible participation, which was conceived of as a mechanism to help disenfranchised communities basically conceive of their own solutions to the problems that they were being confronted with. So this was the maximum feasible participation led to federal funding for community action programs, where during the first year of the war on poverty, the federal government was directly funding grassroots organizations. Groups like Mobilization for Youth here in New York City's Lower East Side that was organizing residents to confront abusive welfare offices and slum landlords and failing public schools. Groups like the Woodlawn Organization in Chicago, which were working with kids who were at risk of falling into gangs or at risk of getting hurt through violent encounters with law enforcement or other youth. And this was essentially this moment when the federal government was providing grassroots groups in an autonomous manner to exercise their own self-determination, to confront the institutions and the structures that they saw as oppressive. And unfortunately, local Democratic officials and urban officials really didn't like all of the funding that were going to grassroots organizations. Some people saw it as kind of a voter registration drive for certain politicians. They really, many municipal officials and public authorities didn't like this kind of conception of power somehow being ceded to the people. And within a year of the war on poverty, by 1965, the community action programs and maximum feasible participation had really kind of waned in terms of its promise. All of a sudden, many of these groups were now being institutionalized in order to receive federal funding. Municipal officials and authorities had to be kind of a part of the planning process. So, no longer was the federal government directly funding grassroots groups. And this also coincides, of course, with Johnson's call for the war on crime. So already we're beginning to get kind of a shift in resources and a priority from really, community empowerment, right, to controlling communities. And eventually, we see what wins out. And what actually gets that kind of institutional, real structural thrust are not the social welfare programs that were being implemented and considered at the same time, but police programs, new carceral programs, surveillance programs in those same communities that are being targeted for social uplift and self-help programs. So this is a real tragedy, but I think it also opens up kind of new possibilities for us to return. It sets a precedent where we can return to this this policy principle of directly funding and empowering communities using federal funding. So there is a history of a kind of community autonomy and self-determination within federal policy that unfortunately was short-lived due to liberals' own racism. But I think it's something that we can aspire to return to, or to think about how to get back to.
So, kind of bringing us closer to the present, just want to turn to Astra, and so one of the things that you were involved with was a fair amount of the incipient and early organizing that emerged after the financial crisis. And something that was really notable about that organizing, and you certainly see this in Occupy, but even just more generally, was the fact that it sort of evolved as a conversation, really not unlike the conversation we've been having today, about the nature of democracy itself. Like, what would a democratic society look like? What would democratic control over the economy, over politics look like? Something that's interesting over the last decade, and since Trump's election as well, is that that has certainly continued, but it's been overlaid with another conversation, which is about debating specific policies. And I guess, the question that I'd love to hear your reflections about would be, how to maintain thinking of our politics as something like a mass insurgency on behalf of democracy itself that might engage with questions of policy, but is not reduced to technocratic fixes.
Ooh, great question. Okay, I'm going to echo all of the thanks that were said here. +1, thanks to Ethan and everyone for having me. The period after the financial crisis was really pivotal for me, and that was when I first started to think about democracy and indebtedness. And in fact, the seeds for my film and my book, and it's been very nice to kind of hear these echoes of my book's title throughout the day. So thank you, everybody. Also, democracy must be real because I'm winning the Slido vote. So thumbs up. But the idea came, I would be chanting, like we've all chanted before, this is what democracy looks like, right? Everyone has chanted this chant. And I'm always curious who has chanted this chant and really felt it 100%. Okay. I find that to be really beautiful. But for me, I've always been like, I hope not. I want us to govern. Democracy can't just be for people. It can't just be my friends. So that was, and being the pragmatist I am, I was like, I'm going to make a movie about this. So I have two hats, and I'm kind of going to wear them both right now. So one is as a writer and filmmaker who deals more with philosophical ideas up in the air, and then as an organizer who deals with trying to build power on the ground, mostly through an organization I co-founded called the Debt Collective, which is a kind of debtors union. The executive director, Laura Hanna, is over there. So these are my two sides, and I actually see democracy as inherently paradoxical. So theory and practice, an ideal and aspiration, and this messy, disappointing reality. And the whole book actually is structured around these paradoxes. So things that I believe we can't settle on one side of the binary or the other. So the local and the global, right? Conflict or consensus, inclusion, exclusion, freedom, equality. So is democracy on the side of freedom? Well, no, it's not fully on the side of freedom. It has to be balanced with equality. And these are really complicated terms that I learned so much actually from Aziz's book, The Two Faces of American Freedom, about the way freedom and equality for some has been predicated on the exclusion and domination of others. We also know, so if freedom needs equality, it's really, we're screwed because we're in a moment of intense inequality, right? 3 billionaires control the wealth of half of Americans. Those billionaires are going to be trillionaires who own the moon soon, or Mars, or wherever it is. And we know concentrated political power is anathema to democracy. And this gathering is a symptom and a response to that, right? That fact, in the sense that this is a foundation. A foundation is all about aggregated capital. It's this tax shelter, right? It's money taken out of democratic purpose. It's a form of private power. And so it's incumbent on us to think about how we use those resources for a democratic purpose, right? Whether we are funders or grantees. So I think that means, I'm just going to go to the simple definition of democracy. The demos, the people have power. Of course, who the people are is open for debate, and how they have power, how they rule is also contestable, which is why I ultimately really love the idea of democracy, because we can expand this concept, we can push it forward. So yes, we need to figure out how to empower the people. And I want to linger on this idea, because that is an idea, as I go around talking about democracy, that's an idea that scares lots of folks, right? Right now, there's a sense that people are unruly, untrustworthy, right? There's a lot of discussion of we live in a populist moment. And I always want to push back on that and say the main threat to us right now is not the tyranny of the majority, it's the tyranny of a minority. And that has been expressed here in multiple ways. I've been so happy that that's the frame. There's progressive popular will for all sorts of things, from climate change, right? Action on climate change, to even immigration. People have warmer attitudes towards immigrants than they did from polls from the mid-60s. Gun control, right? The American public is pretty anti-war, right? They don't want these endless wars, to go back to foreign policy. And yet somehow Donald Trump has been able to capture that energy. So I think that, we need to resist this idea that the majority is the threat and understand that tyranny of the minority is the problem for democracy. So how do we empower the majority? We go to this idea of inclusion, right? That's where our minds go. And in the chapter on inclusion and exclusion, I quote James Baldwin from The Fire Next Time, do I really want to be included? Do I really want to be integrated into a burning house? Right? I love that. I love that quote almost as much as rainbow oligarchy, which is now something I'm going to be ripping off all the time. But the Baldwin quote came to me the other night when I went to see Greta Thunberg speak. We all know that she's the 16-year-old climate striker. She has this thing she says, our house is on fire. I want you to act like the house is on fire because it is, right? And seeing, our house is on fire. We cannot live in this house, right? There's no going back. Climate, capitalism, race, these things are all connected, and we need to douse the flames. There's no return to normalcy. There's no restoring our democracy. We need a new consensus. But to get to a new consensus, we need dissensus. We need to fight. We need rupture. We need contestation. It's going to be messy. We need power. So what is it we're trying to break? What status quo? This picks up, I'm coming after the historians who know their facts. But, okay, I'm going to try to take the next part of the chronology. Late 70s, call it financialization. Felicia gave a great talk about neoliberalism, right? The Reagan-Thatcher revolution or reaction. A new ethics in politics driven by finance and markets emerged, right? So we know that the welfare state was gutted, that there was a kind of transfer from a welfare state to a debt-fair state, easy access to credit, kind of masked wage stagnation, inequalities. Households were forced into debt to finance basic needs. Credit card debt ballooned, student loans ballooned. People were integrated into a burning house. And so there's the phrase predatory inclusion, which I think is so important, right? The terms of credit were not extended to everybody equally. Poor people, Black and brown people, single and working mothers could only access credit at extortionate rates. Redlining adapted, took new forms. It's now online. Cities starved of revenue, imposed fines and fees on populations. This is part of what the Black Lives Matter movement brilliantly exposed. Then, of course, the 2008 financial crisis was really pivotal. Decimated Black wealth. The Obama administration did not use all the power at its disposal to address things. And this was a moment of political awakening for me. This is, again, when democracy and debt took over my life. But it was also a political shift for the millennial generation more broadly, right? There's something, the old idea of freedom and democracy has really changed. So I just quickly want to say there's a pithier way of framing neoliberalism that we at the Debt Collective like to use. What happened is the rich went on tax strike, right? The rich went on tax strike. So that's why they need tax shelters. But also look at Prop 13, right? Reagan knew this. He was capturing what he called a spark to light a wildfire. That's when taxes became an issue. The rich went on tax strike. So what can the poor do? What can working people who don't have wealth, what can they do? What if they went on a debt strike? That's one of the ideas that influenced us. And somebody give a shout out to debtors in revolt today. I think it was Erica Smiley, so thank you. So what if people fight fire with fire is one thing we asked. What if people said can't pay, won't pay, shouldn't pay? In a moral society, you shouldn't have to go into debt because you get cancer or because you want to go to school, right? We started the Debt Collective. We view debt as an asset. $1.6 trillion of student debt transforms into $1.6 trillion of leverage. Launched the student debt strike in 2015, and with through collaborations with allies and advocates have helped win about $1.5 billion of debt relief. Changed laws under the Obama administration. There have been multiple lawsuits against somebody named Betsy at the Department of Education. And also helped to get student debt cancellation and free college on the 2020 agenda. So the Warren campaign has credited our push for debt cancellation with showing that it can be done, right? And, I think I was thinking about from the first panel, I think it was Risha's comments about, this moment for Black Lives Matter of the outburst, and then you kind of try to find different wonkier strategies. I don't really see it as a linear progression, like, oh, first we had Occupy and then we got serious, but because I think sometimes you need to riot. We might have to riot again. But it is part of trying to figure out what strategies can work. Where can we actually exercise power? I'm bringing it up here because I think it's a great example of how an idea that was just, we were dismissed as risible. It was just considered totally unrealistic that there would be debt cancellation. And yet I opened the New Yorker the other day, because I subscribe, because I'm a writer in New York, and I read the words, wide-scale student debt forgiveness no longer seems radical. And I was like, okay, that's good. So this is a personal example of trying to move the needle by building power to resist extractive forms of accumulation and dispossession, demanding structural solutions, not half measures, right? And also doing something that people said was reckless. We went on strike. There are risks, right? We did something that people thought was risky. And also, we thought too, oh, the people aren't ready. Maybe they won't understand the way debt and finance works. Oh my God, we could not handle the demand. School after school, all these people wanted to join debtors unions and join debt strikes and do it. The people were far ahead of where we were, right? And they're far ahead of us in this room on all sorts of issues right now. So I think this is, the financial crisis, what it did was it proved that capitalism can fail, and it also proved the government can spend shit tons of money to intervene in the economy, right? So thus, Greta said the other day, if we can save banks, we can save the planet, right? That's how the 16-year-old thinks now. So I want to just say 3 things to wrap up. This is a moment when we can think big. We can save the planet, right? We can name systems that were unnameable: capitalism, racial capitalism, white supremacy, socialism. We can talk about socialism. Over half of millennials say they prefer socialism to capitalism. Liberals have never won significant reforms without there being socialists in the coalition. We can talk about erasing all student debt and making college free, not because it'll boost the economy or get people jobs, because it's a public good that we deserve and that democracy needs. We can talk about a Green New Deal, right? But big ideas aren't enough. Unfortunately for me, I can't just write philosophy books and make quirky art films. You can't just write white papers, right? We have to build power to actually win these things. The problem has never been ideas. The other day at a vintage bookstore, I bought the Freedom Budget, like an original pamphlet, and I was like so inspired to see that there was a mention of clean air, right? Environmentalism is all in there. It's all there already. The ideas were there. What's lacking is the power. We need to take risks and make people uncomfortable. And yeah, my third point, there's no status quo to return to because our house is on fire, y'all.
Before we open it up for questions, and again, I should have mentioned this earlier, Slido, come up with your questions. Somebody will present those questions. Just as a way to kind of connect the 3 sets of reflections, I'd love to hear you sort of talk a bit more about moving beyond the liberal tradition of reform. We should begin by saying there are tremendous achievements, and this is what Megan noted with Brown versus Board of Education, ending formal discrimination, establishing, however limited, the elements of the social welfare state. These are achievements worth noting as achievements and defending, but there's also clear limitations in the imagination and the approach of the liberal institutions. Like, what ideas and lessons can we draw now for what's been off the table? So Astra was getting at this, and what should be on the table. I'll just note as like a small little plug that, we haven't explicitly talked about foreign policy, internationalism, the global dimension of capitalism, anti-militarism, which strikes me as an historically conscious choice by liberal actors in the institutions themselves to avoid various third rails. And that would strike me as something that has to be part of any serious rethinking of democracy, given the extent to which domestic unfreedom has been bound to external power. But beyond that, broadly, what should be on the table now? Or what lessons can be drawn from the limitations of the past?
Well, historically, when these democratic rights have expanded to previously disenfranchised groups, we get kind of new forms of criminalization and mass incarceration. So in, example of my work, immediately after emancipation in 1865, we get the rise of new laws targeting freed people in the form of black codes and convict leasing. Century later, in the context of landmark civil rights legislation, we get a call for a war on crime and the subsequent rise and vast expansion of the U.S. prison system, which is related to global economic developments, of course. So this then, opens up questions about, what is the relationship between democracy and confinement? And is our forms of confinement and bondage tied to democracy? And if so, what does a kind of abolitionist politics look like? How can we move beyond these kinds of institutions and come up with different sets of responses to social inequalities? So, one of my big questions that my work traces is, why is it, and why did liberal policymakers who were in power in the mid-60s when they and the social scientists who were very influential over these policies began to really worry about demographic changes in U.S. society. Again, we're confronted and policymakers are worried about demographic changes on a global scale due in no small part to climate change. But the response to those demographic changes ultimately was targeted policing and mass incarceration. And so what if we would have invested instead of in police and prisons and courts into school systems, into guaranteed income, into universal secondary and college education for people, into really revamping our education system, for instance, and into a full employment program instead of a job creation program for the people who are in many respects targeted for war on poverty programs. We get a job creation program for police, and in the context of deindustrialization, the domestic industry of the late 20th century and today has really been our prison system and surveillance system and policing and law enforcement systems, crime control in general. So I think part of it is thinking, how can we dismantle these institutions and move past them, and also confronting the difficult question, are these systems of confinement attached somehow to democracy?
Great. So for me, in thinking about this question here, one of the things, as you mentioned, that oftentimes is a response to this story is, well, we got brown. Isn't that a good thing? And my response is normally yes, but because I reject that framing, right? And I want to say two things about that. One, who says that we would not have gotten kind of a focus on, not kind of, but a focus on education, desegregation, if that the lead would not have been racial violence and or labor and or economic justice, right? There's a way in which we have looked back and then developed a narrative that somewhat fits where we are right now. But kind of the idea, and many of us know this, right, is that for many civil rights leaders, the idea is if we focus on education, then some of these other things would follow. We now know that's not the case. And I think that one of this shows, one of the lessons, of course, from this unfortunate and sometimes fortunate story is the complicity of liberal whites in a civil rights paradigm that black leaders at the NAACP and in other organizations in the 1920s knew that it would never bring them true equality. Right? So that's, I think, part of the story here. And obviously the takeaway is that we have to listen to those, again, that are most impacted by the harm if we really want some kind of large-scale change. And then second here is connected, of course, is that the process is important. The process in terms of the sidelining of black voices and the vision of civil rights that's important. The end result and how we got the end result, that's not the only thing that matters, but that voices and people are affirmed and their voices are amplified in a process I think are truly critical. If we care about democracy, we care about that all voices are actually heard. And the last thing, I just want to end on a quote that Janisha from Solidaire, she told me once that's something that they think about a lot there, is that you are all the systems that you are trying to dismantle. And that's just stayed with me.
I've lost the original question, so I'm just going to respond to something she said. Thinking about the education thing, it's what I just got to when I said we need free education because it's a public good required for a vibrant, functional democracy, right? There's a way in which I think we have to start aiming at the thing we're aiming against. You know, if we want to fight economic inequality, then education, it's been shown that that's not the vehicle to do it, right? We should tackle the issue of education on its own terms, but we have to name the systems we're up against, name capitalism, and not just, you know, focus on the problem of poverty, which is a terrible problem, but also the problem of extreme wealth, right? So, you know, I just wrote something for Politico that's called Abolish Billionaires. They said, what would be your one fix for democracy? That would help. You know, we can think of all sorts of ones, but I think I think that is just being sort of more direct in this moment, because we are in a moment, I think, where we can be direct and we have to be direct about what our goals are and what the problems we're facing are.
So I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Go ahead.
Actually, I want to use this opportunity to connect to some of the points made before. How did we get to have all these billionaires? What's going on with freedoms? Well, the people who used 14th Amendment to get rights were corporations, actually. So if you read a book called We the Corporations are not mentioned in the Constitution, but they fought in the courts for civil rights. So, and then to the debt point, again, we have a lot of corporate debt. We have a lot of debt in the financial sector. And so when you ask why people borrow so much, you have to go to the root of, you know, who's lending them and who's actually benefiting from the system. Look at cab drivers in New York or any other extortionary lending. And so it goes back to corporate governance. It goes back to the technicalities of financial regulations and all these things that we do need to connect the dot on, because they are some of the sources of how, you know, how we got some of the inequality, corporate governance and policy related to that. So I just want to throw it in because it connects some of the dots. Who ends up getting freedoms? The sort of legal people.
Any responses or reflections? I mean, so just one quick thought about that is, I think there's oftentimes a tendency to imagine that everybody is on the same side. So part of the story about naming structural injustice, saying capitalism, saying white supremacy, is recognizing, well, the society is not marked by some harmonious we the people, but it's instead, you know, riven with fundamental cleavages between those that are oppressed and those that enjoy oppressive power. And that the political power that those that benefit from the existing system exercise is not remotely akin to any kind of underlying mass support. And so that means like centering struggle as part of our own politics and the way that we describe things, thinking of policy in terms of, you know, what actually would make it less likely for the social order as it exists to reproduce itself. And that's just a different way of narrating the story than the one that we're used to, which is, you know, we in corporations are basically on the same side. Any other questions or thoughts? Go ahead.
I mean, on our phone call, I mentioned that, you know, I one thing that always comes back to me is Martin Luther King's "Where do we go from here? Chaos or community?" And just in terms of, yeah, you can think about where we're at in terms of neoliberalism or this, but he says something very clear, which is, you know, the cost. He says at that point, I think it was published in '67, you know, that basically what had been won was cheap. It doesn't cost anything to integrate a lunch counter, right? But when you're talking about fighting for things that require investment, that's where it gets really tough. And we're still stuck in that struggle. We want things that cost money, that don't just bring new consumers into the fold and create new markets, that aren't priceless. So I always think of that as like that's the struggle we're in, and that's part of why the fights we're waging have taken a long time and are actually really difficult.
Go ahead.
Dan Kant from the Working Families Party. Really inspired by the debt strike conversation. Someone told me that Ford paid its financial advisors $1 billion last year to keep their, you know, stocks high. I thought, well, they could maybe pay them $500 million. They'd still do the same amount of work for you. But I wonder if, like, how do we paint a picture of how this debt strike, which I'm relatively political, I'm barely aware of it, how it gets to a higher level. If there was a serious debt strike for a month, you'd get some unbelievable concessions. So I'm wondering if you can paint a picture of that a little bit for us.
Yeah. So The debt strike began with 15 students who had gone to a predatory for-profit college called Corinthian Colleges, and we began organizing with them. Part of this is a reaction. There was a discussion today about metrics. You know, do we want to go wide and like build a big email list, or do we want to go deep and have people take a brave, bold move? And so, yeah, it started with 15, which is, you know, there are different forms of leverage when you're working on a campaign. There's true economic leverage, which I believe debtor organizing has the potential to amass, right? If you have enough debtors that organizing against a target where they have true economic power, they can withhold their payments. In that, because we began with 15, we had other forms, we had other strategies. So one is, you know, there's a media strategy. We also found in our research something, a little known right in the Higher Education Act called defense to repayment. So people actually do have the right to get their loans canceled if they have been defrauded. But this right nobody knew how to use it. So we created this app with the ambition that one person in each state would use our mobile-friendly app, right? Because we're working with people who they don't have computers, they couldn't go print their applications, and the government didn't even tell them what an application would look like. So we made this tool, and it turned out that tens of thousands of people ended up using it. Maybe even how many by the end? Like over 100,000. Eventually, the Department of Education just took it and put this, you know, Occupy built app on their website, essentially. But that became this thing. So it became a sort of, the strike grew to be hundreds. But then there was this other way in which people who weren't quite ready to make that move were able to dispute their debts. And to that, the massive number of people who did that created a crisis for the Department of Education. And so there was a rulemaking session and all of this, right? So it's something, you know, what bureaucracy is so weaponized. It's so hard for people to exercise their rights. So one thing we were trying to do is also, you know, build our own bureaucratic weapon. So we've created, as we're expanding now beyond this campaign to work with other kinds of debtors, if you go to debtcollective.org, you'll see that we've got a suite of debt dispute tools that what they do is they take what is a very atomizing, individualizing, dehumanizing process of trying to find the forums to dispute your debts and, you know, exercise your rights. And we make it easy, effortless, and collective and political. So the tools themselves also have a political education component. But the idea, and then we will organize people into collectives based on their debt type, based on their creditor, based on their region, and organize with the ambition of engaging in collective bargaining, interest reduction, principal reduction, full abolition, demand for public goods, et cetera. So it's inspired by a labor organizing model. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel. I've been really interested in the constant reframing or retelling of what we think of as typical American historical narratives that all of you have really brought to the fore. And in that vein, it's made me think about the reactions to the New York Times Magazine's 1619 special issue. I had the great good fortune of being in conversation with the editor of the National Review right after that issue came out. And he was very clear about just how wrong, not just any individual piece there was, but the entire premise, because his argument was that no, right, America was not founded on slavery, it was founded on liberty. And, you know, it's very easy, by the way, for all of us in this room to roll our eyes at that. But I have a very serious question. That view, I think, is not uncommon in some perhaps less weaponized or less politicized way, but like what kind of conversation ought we be in with people who believe that in perhaps like maybe a more neutral, I don't know if that's possible, but what do you say to somebody like that, or do you just roll your eyes and walk away?
So, yeah. So that's
by the way, you can. Sorry, let me just. You could also like make all kinds of factual arguments with these, but so, like that, I was presuming that neither walking away nor factual arguments were necessarily going to get you to some other place.
So I have kind of two related thoughts about this. That there are a lot of background structural reasons why this was the case, but it basically became the conventional wisdom among left liberals that the only plausible way to build a coalition in American life is to just accede to this framing. That the country's been free and equal from the founding, it's grounded in liberty and not oppression, and that really the problems that we see as structural and foundational are problems at the margins. And, you know, I don't think that that was a ridiculous position to take as it emerged really in like the post-60s, and in many ways, like Obama is the apotheosis of linking one's personal biography to this story. And it generated, you know, genuine political electoral successes. But I think at the same time, one of the first things to notice is, you know, one way of thinking about how the National Review editors is experiencing this kind of dislocation of being told actually your society is a settler society,
Yeah,
is to realize that, you know, what this required oppressed people to do was a deep act of alienation and estrangement. To have to re-narrate your own experience of oppression in terms that are conducive to what the majority society believes. And I actually think it fundamentally undermines also the practice of movement organizing, building power, where like the only terms you're allowed to use are narratives that require you to tell people that are oppressed that actually their story is one of progressive historical improvement. So, you know, my own view is that we have to, if we're going to be serious about our own politics and historical analysis, we have to just fundamentally break from this. But that does not mean, to me, and this is why, like, one of the things that I've found frustrating about the last few years, I'm not the only person, everybody finds this frustrating, is class first, race first debates, which oppression is more significant. That does not mean that when you're engaged in making arguments and convincing people about like concrete issues on the ground, that everybody has to agree with the same kind of foundational premises. You know, when you think about King and King's effort to build a poor people's movement, that was about finding strategic agreement on specific issues that relate to people's everyday material interests, and then through those strategic commitments and agreements, building a sense of friendship, alliance that transcends just like the purely material. And just as nobody is going to convince me that, you know, my experience of this country is founded on an electable story of liberal progress, I don't need to convince somebody else that what they understand to be the premises of their own society is the exact opposite. What I need to do is find common ground around the actual concrete material conditions that oppress us both.
Great answer.
I think we're supposed to wrap up. So, so with that, thanks so much to the panelists. New account of democracy, freedom for all.